International news now.
All right, so before getting into the details and debate about TikTok, we're going to put this story in a broader context. I want to start by going back in time to look at how the rise of China has shaped this evolving relationship with the United States. For decades, the story of China was marked by incredibly high economic growth and its emergence as a great power on the world stage. Since China began to open up and reform its economy in 1978, GDP growth has averaged over 9% a year. And so in my years, during the past 4 decades, over the past 4 decades, China's economy has experienced double-digit growth. By comparison, economic growth in the United States and other Western countries has hovered around 2% annually. So years of strong economic growth that far outpaced the growth of the United States economy has made China an economic peer and rival of the U.S. The rapid change in the relative sizes of the U.S. and Chinese economies has been astonishing. In 1980, the U.S. economy was 19 times larger than the Chinese economy, but by 2016, the U.S. economy was less than twice as large as China's.
See, I've always liked the 80s.
You in the 80s. Here we go again. Moreover,
no TikTok.
No TikTok.
Big U.S. economy.
His favorite movie was Red Dawn. Right?
No, it wasn't.
So more.
Oh, man, that was a good movie.
All right, so moreover, with more than 4 times the population of the United States, the size of the Chinese economy has provided it with significant leverage in the global economy as a consumer market, a source of foreign investment, and the largest producer of manufactured output in the world. China's remarkable economic growth provided resources for a dramatic military buildup, particularly over the last 2 decades. As a result, China's military has grown in both size and quality, which has allowed China to overcome historic American military advantages. And so with this increased military capacity, China has formulated a more ambitious foreign policy, particularly in Asia and regions in China's backyard, such as the South China Sea. In short, China's emergence as a great power has been one of the most important international developments of the past 30 years. And China's combination of economic and military power makes it the country most capable of challenging the U.S.-led international order.
I mean, we should really put a point on this, right? I mean, during the Cold War, the Soviet Union was a really big threat to the United States and its nuclear arsenal and its ideology, everything. But even compared to the Soviet Union and its height during the Cold War, China is an unusually powerful now threat to the United States in terms of its economic power. It's integrated into the international economy the way the Soviet Union never was. I mean, this is a big deal, don't you think? Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean completely. If we look at the Soviet threat versus the Chinese threat, the Soviets never modernized their economy in a way that could facilitate sustained economic competition with the United States. This is one of the primary reasons they've collapsed. It's the alternative. It's very different in China in a sense. Integrated capitalist institutions open themselves up to globalization and created much more long-run potential for economic growth. And so, right, in retrospect, we can imagine the Soviet Union collapsing because the economy couldn't sustain all of the resources diverted to military production. That's not the case with China, right? And much more in this for the long run relative to the economic competition with the United States.
We need to all understand that so that because sometimes it seems like, why are we so worried about China? There's good reasons, right? And so, okay, so let's build on this and examine now how the United States has responded to this change that Professor McDonald just outlined about a rising China that has gotten much more, a much bigger economy, but also a much stronger and effective military. And as China's status and its ambitions grew, the United States did respond. It took notice of this, and it made moves to counter China's rise and its increased influence. And so the United States has long tried to manage the power of China. It even did it prior to the end of the Cold War, but I'm going to concentrate on the steps that were taken to address this challenge during the terms of the most recent 3 presidents, Barack Obama, Donald Trump, Joe Biden, right? Each of these administrations viewed China as a rising power and America's next primary competitor. So we were trying under these presidents to get ready for the next big great power confrontation, and that was going to be with China. How did these administrations do that? For example, the Obama administration called for a significant shift in U.S. foreign policy that it called its pivot to Asia. And this policy called for a rebalance of resources and attention away from what our fixation was under his predecessor, George W. Bush, on wars in the Middle East, and toward investments in relations with American allies in East Asia and Southeast Asia. And the primary goal with bolstering those relations was to counter China's rise and to sort of constrain it or contain it, some people would say, harking back to the containment policy of the Cold War, right? And one of the cornerstones of this pivot to Asia for the Obama administration was its proposal of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or the TPP. And that was a trade agreement with 12 countries in the Pacific Rim, and it was intentionally excluding China. China was left out, everybody else was in, the United States was the leader, and that was a way to constrain economic power of China and its economic influence in the Pacific region. So that was their big, foundational, instrument, right? They were going to contain the Chinese economy through this partnership. However, the Obama administration, pushed through the agreement, signed the agreement, but it never was ratified as a treaty, an agreement by the United States, because there was resistance to it from both parties. There was a core constituency in the Republican Party and in the Democratic Party that worried about American workers and things like that. And so there was enough opposition in both parties that ultimately, once Donald Trump won the presidency in 2016, and he took right away in his term in office, the Trump administration withdrew the United States from the Trans-Pacific Partnership in January 2017. But Trump didn't shy away from the confrontation that Obama started with the TPP, and he enhanced it and doubled down on it. And what the Trump administration did was it made confronting China a centerpiece of its foreign policy as well. But its preferred instrument in confronting China was tariffs that were designed to rebalance the U.S.-China trade relationship, right? And so beginning in January 2018, the Trump administration introduced all these new tariffs and other trade barriers on China with the goal of forcing China to change what the United States considered its unfair trading practices and its widespread theft, China's widespread theft of intellectual property that belonged to American companies. And this confrontation using tariffs sparked a trade war between the United States and China that lasted pretty much through the whole term of Donald Trump. And then finally, the Biden administration starts, and the Biden administration sort of uses both military and economic means to continue this effort to confront China. And so on the economic side, the Biden administration implemented policies to both protect existing American economic advantages and promote the development of new ones, right? And so, for example, the Biden administration issued new rules that cut off access for Chinese firms to manufacture advanced computer chips. And so they were trying to constrain Chinese capability and sustain the advantage that the United States had and its allies had in that realm. And at the same time, the Biden administration passed the CHIPS Act and the Inflation Reduction Act that invested hundreds of billions of dollars of subsidies in the domestic American economy related to manufacturing so that the United States could be producing these microchips and other high-tech products rather than rely on other countries. And so now on the military side, Biden expanded military cooperation with allies in the Pacific, especially Australia, which had struck a deal to sell American submarines, nuclear-powered submarines, to modernize Australia's Navy. And by doing this, the United States expanded the military capabilities of a stable American ally within, China's backyard, its region of influence, to help it contain China. And so this has been a long-standing bipartisan effort. We are confronting China now.
Okay, so now we want to move to our discussion surrounding the bill to force China.
We got to get back to TikTok.
Back to TikTok.
So.
To force the parent companies of TikTok to sell TikTok to American investors or face some sort of national ban on TikTok in the United States. And so we're going to start this section with a clip from NBC News that provides some background on the bill on TikTok that recently passed the House of Representatives. So let's roll that clip now.
If signed into law, it would give Chinese parent company ByteDance just 6 months to divest TikTok or face the possibility of a ban on the app. The legislation prompted by national security concerns, including fears the Chinese government could access Americans' personal data and feed them content that would influence their views.
Our intention is for TikTok to continue to operate, but not under the control of the Chinese Communist Party.
50 Democrats and 15 Republicans voted no.
It's an overly broad bill that I don't think will withstand First Amendment scrutiny.
It's opening Pandora's box, and I'm opposed to this bill.
Aligning with former President Trump, who once tried to ban TikTok, but now says he's against that. TikTok fighting back hard, even flying creators to Washington.
Hello, this is my son.
Jason Linton shares his life as a dad with his 13 million followers.
What would it mean for you and your family if TikTok were to be banned in the U.S.?
It would be devastating. Being able to just launch out a positive message would be completely stopped.
Wish it was a bad dream, but it's not.
JT Laybourne uses TikTok to promote his clothing company.
Do you think this could impact how people vote?
100%. There will be people that will not be reelected because of the way they choose to vote on this ban.
TikTok says it has 170 million users in the U.S. According to an NBC News poll, 22% of voters say they use the app once a day or more. The potential political fallout with those young voters not lost on some senators.
Cutting out a large group of young voters is not the best known strategy for re-election.
Republican Mike Gallagher, one of the bill's sponsors, says that's not a good enough reason to ignore a looming national security threat.
I don't think courting the clicks of 17-year-olds should take precedence over allowing our foremost foreign adversary to dominate what is increasingly becoming the primary news source for Americans under the age of 30.
Sorry,
you just missed Professor Moser doing a little dance here.
Well, that guy on the clip, man, he was crying and then he was happy because he was on TikTok.
So the first thing, here he goes. So the first thing to know about this bill is that it has broad bipartisan support. The measure had 352 votes in favor and only 80 who voted against or abstained. Among Republicans, the vast majority, 197 members, voted in favor, with only 15 Republicans voting against. Slightly more Democrats were opposed, 50. That still pales in comparison to the 155 Democrats who supported it. This reinforces our point from the previous section that countering China is one of the issues that unites both major political parties in the United States. Second, as the clip shows, the sponsors of the bill want to be clear that its primary aim is not to ban TikTok, which would be very difficult and controversial, but to instead to force the Chinese parent company to sell TikTok to American investors. The problem, at least, as most legislators seem to frame it, is not TikTok per se, but it's China and who controls access to the data of TikTok. The argument's the following. TikTok's parent company is a Chinese company called ByteDance. Because ByteDance is based in China, it is subject to Chinese laws that require it to hand over data on U.S. users of TikTok if requested by the Chinese government. Moreover, China could also leverage its influence over ByteDance to influence the type of information and content found on TikTok, favoring information or algorithms that benefit and support Chinese interests at the expense of American interests. Despite the enormous support for the bill in the House, this bill is not law yet. It must be passed by the Senate, which some observers argue seems more skeptical about forcing a sale of TikTok or imposing a ban. The process may slow down a bit in the Senate. Lawmakers in both parties have said they wanted the bill to go through a thorough review before a vote. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, a Democrat, said he'll have to consult with relevant committee chairs to determine the bill's path. However, there are powerful senators who support the bill and are pushing for its quick adoption. For example, Democratic Senator Mark Warner, chairman of the Intelligence Committee, and Republican Senator Marco Rubio, the top Republican on the same committee, put out a joint statement that said, quote, "We are united in our concern about the national security threat posed by TikTok, a platform with enormous power to influence and divide Americans, whose parent company, ByteDance, remains legally required to do the bidding of the Chinese Communist Party," unquote. For his part, President Biden has already said that he will sign the bill if it reaches his desk. Thus, there's a pretty decent chance that this bill can become law in some form.
Right. And so, now there's one person who is not calling on China to sell TikTok and definitely is not in favor of a ban on TikTok, and that's Donald Trump. Now, this is a relatively new position for Trump, so let's make some sense of this change. And so we're going to start with a very short clip from the news, I think it's NBC News, might be ABC, I can't remember, that captures Donald Trump and his reasoning in his own words. And so let's roll that clip now.
U.S. intelligence agencies have included TikTok among their top threats to national security. But now, former President Trump, who spearheaded efforts to ban the app when he was president, is reversing course and opposing the bill. In an interview yesterday, he said a ban would make young people, quote, "go crazy."
There are a lot of users. There's, a lot of good, and there's a lot of bad with TikTok. But the thing I don't like is that without TikTok, you can make Facebook bigger. And I consider Facebook to be an enemy of the people.
Trump's reversal comes just days after he met with a Republican donor who reportedly has a major financial stake in TikTok. But Trump denies speaking to that donor about TikTok at their meeting.
All right, so let's go over this a little bit. As president, when he was elected in 2016, Donald Trump threatened and tried to ban TikTok through executive action. And at the time when he was doing that, he noted the very same concerns about data privacy and disinformation that are similar to the concerns of the supporters of the current bill in the House of Representatives that just passed on TikTok. And so now, as you saw from the clip, there's some good and there's some bad with the TikTok. And so why the change? And in that clip, Donald Trump does offer a few reasons to buttress his logic here. And the first one he just notes the popularity of TikTok, that especially for young Americans, they would go crazy, so to speak, if they lost TikTok. And so, why would he want to do that, or why would anybody want to jeopardize their relationship with a huge segment of the electorate, a huge segment of the population? And so part of it is just a sort of political maneuver to maintain support for, or maybe increase support from a constituency that historically, at least in the two elections he ran, were not really that supportive of Donald Trump. So this could be a good political move on his part if he contrasts himself, especially with a President Biden who could be seen as antagonistic to TikTok, right?
I mean, on the other hand, I was going to say, why not let so partly in the background of this, and Durbin mentioned this as well, the background is how are 20-somethings, 18 to 29 people who are more likely to use TikTok, how are they going to vote in the 2024 election?
Right.
And so partly I wonder, well, if he lets the ban go through, and then because of that if that segment of the voting population, if they're more likely to favor Democrats, then
well, I do think that
then it could hurt the Democrats more, right?
Well, I mean, this is what I find interesting about this is if you contrast this to what he said about aid to Ukraine, the forcefulness isn't quite there, right? I don't think he's trying to stop the legislation from going through. He's just taking a position that I think places him in good stead with younger voters when it does something happens, right? And so because I don't at least, I'll just sense the pressure that he put on Republicans not to pass that bill that had border security that would have really jeopardized his electoral fortunes if it passed, because it would have hurt him. He's not putting the pressure on Republicans to not pass this legislation. He's just saying, you know, I'm not one of those old guys that don't understand the value. There's some good and there's some bad, you know?
I think number two.
Number two is the big thing, though. And this is a rather novel thing just from Donald Trump. Everyone else is fixated on the threat from TikTok, but what he argues, and you saw it in the clip, is that what he's worried about is that if there is some regulation for TikTok that diminishes its presence in the landscape of social media in the United States, that would just help Meta, he says Facebook, but that parent company Meta, who has both Facebook and Instagram, and to Trump, that's the bigger threat. And he says, quote, because I consider them an enemy of the people. And now this is you should chime in here. This is a really important statement here, because in contrasting a social media company that is potentially very influenced by the Chinese Communist Party and the government, he sees that as a much lesser threat than an American company, Meta, that he sees as an enemy of the people. I mean, that's a stark comment, right?
It is. You framed it very well, and I don't think there's anything else to say.
It's a bit shocking to me. But anyway, I think that's part of his logic, is that, you can't help the other American social media companies because they don't work for him, right? They're potential threats. Because he sees, and just to give the argument some, it's due, if you will, he argues, and others agree, that platforms like Facebook or others discriminate against conservatives on their content, and that's why he sees it as many of the people. And then finally, as the clip also showed, there's some who say, well, Trump kind of just got influenced because he met with a big donor that he's going to need to rely on for election donations, that had or has financial interest in TikTok, and he might have been talked into dropping his position on abandoning TikTok because of that tie. And he denies talking about TikTok with this guy, but there could be some.
Well, and we should give a little bit more background on this, because there's an important fundraiser that the Democrats just held in New York that raised a bunch of money, and the news that's coming out over the last week or so is that Biden is now moving way far ahead in terms of fundraising for the 2024 election,
that's true.
that Trump is falling behind. And not only that, Trump has increasing financial difficulties because of all his legal bills and this issue with coming up with the $450 million bond that was now, the $175 million bond. He's having more difficulties raising money for campaign. And so this is part of the backstory here as well that we should watch and think about this in the context of the TikTok.
Now, there is a social media side to this, and that's the big, his Truth Social thing that could make him billions of dollars.
Well, and that'll solve the New York problem, but it won't solve the campaign donations problem. So let's now move to the heart of the matter, the arguments for and against the ban on TikTok. And so I want to start with the arguments that TikTok present a serious threat to U.S. national security that requires a dramatic response.
You just don't get it. You hate TikTok.
Including potentially a ban on the app. All right, so we're going to start with, you set me up to talk about this intentionally, right?
I wasn't going to be the guy. I promised Fernanda that I wouldn't do that.
All right, so I'm the bad cop in this one. All right, so we're going to start with a clip from the PBS NewsHour that provides the main reason so many in Washington see TikTok as a national security threat, as framed by two House members, one Republican and one Democrat, who are the main co-sponsors of the bill in the House. So let's go ahead and roll that clip now.
What is the danger of TikTok that you see?
The fundamental danger is that TikTok is owned by ByteDance, and ByteDance is beholden to the Chinese Communist Party. So from this flow two concerns, one being the security of Americans' data on the platform, but the other, and I think broader concern, is the potential for this platform to be used for the propaganda purposes of the Chinese Communist Party. And there we got a preview of what could happen in that scenario last week when TikTok pushed a push notification to all its users asking them for their zip code and then having them call members of Congress. It was based on a completely inaccurate message to their users, and you had teenagers calling Congress saying, you know, if you ban TikTok, I'll kill myself. Imagine what could happen the closer we get to an election. The unclassified Director of National Intelligence Assessment released yesterday said TikTok is already being used to target members of Congress in both parties politically.
I know both of you probably have got those phone calls, including today. And I know this is a carefully targeted bill, but still today we saw on the Hill TikTok creators and other members of Congress speaking out saying they think that this is a violation of basic rights. I wonder how you approach the First Amendment issues. Do you understand the First Amendment issues at play, the business issues at play, and why is this worth it?
Sure. Well, first of all, there's no First Amendment right to espionage. There's no First Amendment right to harm our national security. Basically, we commonly have foreign ownership laws with regard to broadcast outlets, telecoms, railroads, banks, and so forth. So this is not unusual. What we're saying is that an establishment such as this platform can basically engage in free speech as it is. We are not trying to ban the content or trying to discriminate between one type of speech versus another. What we're concerned about is the conduct of the platform and being used in the ways that Mike alluded to. For instance, weaponizing data against people, endangering our national security in other ways, interfering in our elections, basically doing the things that go against our national security. So we want this platform to continue to operate. We don't want to ban it, but we are calling for a divestment of TikTok by ByteDance so that we can continue to have this platform operate, but without the control of the CCP.
All right, so let us make a few points here. The first thing to note is that TikTok is a hugely successful app that now has a central role in the social media space in the US and around the world. The success has put a target on TikTok because unlike all its main competitors, such as Meta, which owns Facebook and Instagram, YouTube, Snapchat, LinkedIn, and even X, formerly Twitter, which are all American companies, TikTok is owned by the Chinese parent company ByteDance. One can see the success of TikTok in the two graphics shown on the slide. First, the growth of TikTok since 2019 is stunning and far outperforms other social media platforms in the US. TikTok far outstrips the growth of Facebook and Instagram in terms of total minutes used by Americans. Another metric that speaks to the intense popularity and devotion to TikTok is the average daily number of minutes that TikTok users stay on TikTok. According to Business Insider, the average TikTok user spends 100 minutes each day on the app, nearly 2 hours per day. Yep, that's what I do, right? Every
2 hours.
2 hours a day. Compare this to Instagram, whose average users spend 58 minutes a day on the app, and the typical Facebook user who spend around 45 minutes a day on the app.
Facebook.
So the other key aspect of TikTok's success is its dominance among younger Americans. According to one survey, TikTok is already the most widely used social media platform among American teenagers. 63% of teens said they use TikTok, followed by 60% for Snapchat, 59% for Instagram, and only 33% for Facebook. Only YouTube had more teen users with 93% of teens using its platform. This dominance among young users has raised further concerns that China could use its leverage over TikTok to influence young Americans with disinformation and other potential, and additionally potentially mobilize them politically in ways that are beneficial to China and harmful to the U.S., as referred to in the video that Gallagher was talking about. So it's important here to talk briefly about what's driving this popularity, what makes TikTok unique. I feel woefully
I've already done the research for you, son.
Unprepared to answer that question.
It's quite an app, man. You better come on, keep going.
Right.
I'm sure you're pretending not to love TikTok, but as you'll see, he knows all about it.
So first, TikTok is very easy to use.
See?
People are able to just take out their phone
preacher.
and start filming. Users can apply different clips of music or sounds to their videos, and then other users can
See? You love TikTok. Keep going.
I'm sure this is all news to our students, isn't it? Right?
Yeah.
Second, unlike Facebook, TikTok is less about connecting with your family and friends and more about getting you to watch all these short videos. So it's more like television, less of a traditional social media app. When you open the app, you're immediately served this unending stream of really short videos. And most importantly,
You're blowing it.
I know I am. Its algorithm is great. The app starts paying.
I should have done this part.
The app starts paying attention to what you do next. It looks at all the ways you interact with the video, what second you switch away from it, if you comment on the video, if you send it to a friend, the app keeps track of all that information.
Right? This algorithm is really effective.
And it's using that to quickly tailor the next video you see and all the ones after it. Simply put, the algorithm is excellent at figuring out what you liked and serving you more of that.
And here we should make a serious point about, they cracked the code, really. And that's, everybody's kind of trying to catch up with TikTok. And because everybody tries to, with likes and everything, figure out what you want to see and then give you more. But TikTok is just so much better at it, I'm told, than anything else. And so it just constantly, and then when my wife was on TikTok, she got off. I told her about the Chinese influence, but she was like, yeah, China can have my information. What are they going to do with it, right? But then she realized pretty quickly it's really addicting. Yeah. And then you spend more and more time because it keeps giving you all the stuff you really want to see, and you can't stop. And some would argue that's a reason to regulate TikTok is because it's, too good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's be clear, we're not saying that Congress is banning TikTok in the current bill because it wants to help American companies in their competition with TikTok because it's owned by a Chinese company.
Some could argue the U.S. government is just trying to limit TikTok because American companies are falling behind TikTok. And that's, if you listen to the legislators, that's not their intent. Now, if it was there, they probably wouldn't really admit to it. But you do kind of have to acknowledge that there is a business side to this, that some companies, American companies, would benefit if TikTok.
Yeah, and there are already American, in particular Steve Mnuchin, the former Treasury Secretary in the Trump administration, that's already trying to put together a financial consortium to buy TikTok if it's forced by Congress to do so. There's already American investors that see a huge opportunity here to step into. And so you can make an argument, right, that congressional action here is going to make
somebody rich.
U.S. investors a lot richer relative to Chinese investors and the Chinese government.
But the stated reason is not that.
Yeah, instead politicians, intelligence services, and others are concerned about TikTok because, being a Chinese-owned company, they presume it is beholden to the Chinese government and the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, which are hostile rivals to the U.S. So there are two primary concerns here that directly stem from that ownership structure of TikTok. Data privacy concerns and concerns about disinformation and related threats like election interference, which are prompted because the algorithm is so good. So first, let's outline the data privacy concerns. Like other social media companies, TikTok collects an enormous amount of data from its users. However, as a Chinese company, there is arguably a greater danger that the data collected by TikTok could be used against American users. Why? Because there's a Chinese law that requires private companies in China to turn over confidential information requested by the Chinese government. Given that law, it's not too great a leap to imagine that data on US users could be used by the Chinese government to spy on, blackmail, or influence American users of TikTok, or figure out general patterns of data or general patterns of behavior among American voters or among American individuals, like how they think this demographic that's using TikTok is going to vote, so they can make predictions about what's going to happen in the election.
And they could kind of try to steer it through other pushes of different information.
Yeah. So the second big concern is that the actual content that appears on TikTok and the potential for disinformation and information campaigns that could harm U.S. interests. Besides being used for entertainment, TikTok is also a major source of news and information for many of its users, particularly young people. The fear is that the Chinese government could harness TikTok to spread misinformation or censor certain content and basically influence what Americans are thinking. For example, the Chinese government could use TikTok to promote or suppress certain content when it works in their favor.
Right, and so those are the two big concerns, right? So we're gonna dig deeper into one of the criticisms about TikTok with an example. And so we're gonna start with an audio clip from the Daily podcast from about a year ago when they first started covering this issue. And it's an example of data privacy problems with TikTok. So let's roll that clip now.
So, Sapna, you just told me that in 2022, we started to see some real there when it came to, actual security risks from TikTok. What were we seeing at that time?
So there's some reporting from BuzzFeed News that comes out that starts really exploring the relationship between ByteDance in China and TikTok in the United States.
BuzzFeed reports that China-based employees of ByteDance have repeatedly accessed non-public data about U.S. TikTok users.
It shows that apparently employees of ByteDance in China have been getting their hands on the data of U.S. users. And this kind of data was accessed repeatedly by employees who are based in China.
Potentially exposing Americans' personal information to China's government.
And the reporting at BuzzFeed News makes this allegation based on internal recordings at the company.
Employees can be heard saying phrases like everything is seen in China and also refer to Beijing-based engineers as the master admin who have access to everything.
And a few months later, it emerges that ByteDance employees actually went on to try and track this journalist and figure out where she was getting these leaks.
I don't know when they first tried to track me.
Wow, so that does seem like the kind of thing that the U.S. government was worried about, right?
That's right. And ByteDance basically admitted that 4 of its employees had been obtaining the data of this journalist using her IP address.
That means the company knows the IP address of my house, which I'd rather they didn't, but
they say they fired these bad actors, and these are isolated incidents, and they try to move on.
So it does feel vindicating to hear that the company has acknowledged that they did this and that they're taking responsibility for it.
But at the end of the day, there's really no putting a genie back in the bottle.
Once it is accessed in Beijing, the idea that there's a clawback or way to control or limit access, it just doesn't make sense.
And all of a sudden, this gives a lot of ammunition to lawmakers who have already been concerned about TikTok.
This company should be banned. I don't know why they're allowed to operate in the United States.
And around this time, everything just really starts escalating. You have the FBI director warning that the Chinese government could use TikTok for influence operations.
All of these things are in the hands of a government that doesn't share our values and that has a mission that's very much at odds with what's in the best interest of the United States. That should concern.
All right, so let me say a few things here. The first thing to say here is that TikTok and its defendants, so TikTok when there's all these, during the whole debate over the bill, they've always said the same thing, and that is that they've defended their company, and then there's others outside of TikTok that do the same, and they say there's no evidence that TikTok has really mishandled U.S. data. And then TikTok came out with a statement that said effectively that, the Chinese government has never requested any data for TikTok, and if they did ask, we'd say no, and so that's their answer to this, is that, while the possibility, one could debate about that, the actual reality is that this just doesn't happen. But, and this is why we're looking at this, in 2022, as the clip points out, BuzzFeed reported an incident that kind of gives some gravity to these hypothetical concerns about Chinese influence over ByteDance and ByteDance influence over TikTok. And so what they found was that there were employees in China that were getting access to data of U.S. Users, right? And then in the course of this investigation, they got a hold of some internal documents of TikTok that did make claims that clearly stated that engineers in China had access to all the U.S. data. And so these reports showed that ByteDance and TikTok's used TikTok's private data also to do some pretty nefarious things. They tracked a journalist that had leaked some information about the company, and they're trying to find where that journalist got the leaked information, right? They're trying to, one can go a few steps pretty realistically to say, they could have put pressure on that U.S. journalist. They could have changed the story because they've got the data to do it. And so this example, we wanted to point out, the implication here is that these concerns are real, that it is possible that the Chinese government could gain access to all this information. And it's not ridiculous to be fearful of that. And so like one senator, I think it was Marco Rubio, says TikTok's a loaded gun. Why would we just not regulate it? Because the potential is there. And this example suggests the potential is real.
So let's now take up the opposing side that argues that a forced sale of TikTok or ban is a bad idea for the United States. And we're going to start with a clip from the NewsHour that explains objections to the current bill on TikTok due to concerns that it would violate First Amendment protections of free speech. So let's run that clip.
So if TikTok is forced to divest, how does that infringe upon one's First Amendment rights? Because if I want to post on TikTok, I can still post whatever I'm posting no matter who owns it.
Well, there's two things that could happen, right? One is that it will just shut down. It won't have a non-Chinese owner. That could happen. Then those who previously used the site and received information from it wouldn't get that anymore. If they're sold to a U.S. company or sold to other ownership, then that still may affect First Amendment rights because the new owners may have different editorial policies. In fact, it seems like, based on the comments of the sponsors gave on your show yesterday, is that they wanted to have different editorial policies. They wanted to show different content to U.S. users and to treat their content in different ways. So again, that's an infringement on the user's First Amendment rights. What Congress wants is for them to get different information. They're doing that through having different ownership and different editorial policies. I think we've all seen what a change in ownership can mean for the editorial policies of a social media company and for users' experiences with it and whether they want to engage with that service.
You and your organization have called instead for comprehensive data privacy legislation. How exactly would that work, and how would that solve this TikTok problem?
So again, this really relies on if the problem is a data privacy problem, and this is what some people have said early on to justify the bill, a concern that too much U.S. user data was flowing to the Chinese government, and then that itself represented a national security concern. And we agree that the flow of U.S. user data is a serious problem, not just for national security reasons, but also for individual privacy purposes. But you address privacy concerns by passing privacy laws. What we do not have in the U.S. is comprehensive data privacy regulation that controls how much data companies can collect about their users in the first place, when, to the extent they can retain such data, and how they can share such data. If companies, TikTok or anybody else, were not collecting and retaining and sharing so much data in the first place, you wouldn't need to single out TikTok for such exceptional treatment.
So the primary arguments against a ban on TikTok is that such action could potentially violate the free speech protections of Americans who choose to use TikTok as their preferred source of entertainment or even news and information. As stated on the clip, Americans' right to free speech may be violated because the critics argue that one of the major goals of a ban is to influence content on TikTok. And once you start trying to control content, then you are entering the territory of free speech protections. Note that the interview poses an important question. What if the law simply forces China to sell TikTok to American investors? Wouldn't American users then still be free to use TikTok, which would leave their free speech rights intact? However, the critic of the law argued that even if the law only forced China to divest from TikTok, this could influence content and thus violate free speech of users. And he might have a point here. Mike Gallagher, the leading Republican co-sponsoring the bill that just passed the House, explicitly warned about the potential threatening content that the Chinese government could pressure TikTok to put on its platform. What this critic is arguing is that the First Amendment constrains the US government from preventing China from doing that, because if Americans want to get their news from TikTok, they have a First Amendment right to do so, even if it's biased towards Chinese interests and tainted by Chinese propaganda.
That's going to be a tough argument to pursue, it seems to me. But that's the argument, right?
So critics also have an answer to the problem of data privacy on TikTok. The critics argue that if data privacy is truly the goal, a better alternative is to pass a law that regulates the ability of all social media companies to collect and distribute users' private information, since all social media platforms, not just TikTok, infringe on the privacy of users by collecting huge amounts of personal data on their users and then selling that data to third parties.
So they just want a broad law that applies to everybody, not just just TikTok.
Yeah, and politically, let's recognize this. While there is clearly a demand for a broad law, then that also opens up to a much more complicated political process, and that could be a policy recommendation that's just designed to kill it.
Right. And you know, that's not on the table abroad. You know, they'd never get that done. They could get some regulation on TikTok because of the threat from a hostile adversary of the United States Chinese government. So, all right, let's land this plane, right? We'll end our conversation with some predictions here. And so, the question...
But don't invest any money on these predictions.
No, I wouldn't. Well, what's going to happen here to TikTok after all is said and done? And so I'm going to lay out 3 scenarios.
Okay.
And Professor McDonald here is going to pick them, and hopefully he'll do a better job than what he did on his March Madness brackets. I'm sure he's busted by now. So here are the 3 things. I would say that there is a reasonable chance that the Senate just doesn't pass the bill. For a variety of political calculations, mostly, I would say, the Senate could just avoid this. And then if the Senate doesn't pass the bill, then it doesn't become law. TikTok remains a Chinese company, at least for now. You know, the Biden administration could try to use executive action instead and probably run into some court battles that would slow it down or kill it, and everything just remains the same. That is one thing. I would say that, you know, both parties are going to have some pressure. I mean, both senators from both parties are going to have some pressure to pass this because of the overwhelming support in the House of Representatives, but it's not obvious. So the second option would be that the Senate does pass the bill. It does go to the President Biden's desk and he signs it and it becomes law. And TikTok is sold to Mnuchin and that consortium of U.S. buyers. And then in that scenario, TikTok basically still is TikTok and it's just owned by, U.S. Investors, and problem solved. And then people start at least assuming that the data privacy problem might be mitigated, or at least the Chinese government's access to the data would be more limited, and problem solved, and everybody's happy. That would be one possible outcome, kind of the optimal one from a lot of people's viewpoint. The third one would be that the bill passes, right, becomes law, but the sale of TikTok is somehow blocked or limited by the Chinese government, because you have to think that China is going to be really wary about being forced to sell off such a high-profile company, carte blanche, right, with all of its assets, right? And so China might say, yeah, you could buy TikTok, but you can't have the algorithm. Well, TikTok without the algorithm wouldn't be TikTok. And so if something like that happens, and TikTok can't execute the sale that's now required by law, then you get down to the ban, path, right? And then the law would require that TikTok gets banned. And what that looks like is then a whole range of different possibilities. But one of them would be that a ban simply means that it won't be available. The TikTok app would just not be available on, widespread app stores like Apple and the like. And so I don't think even that would mean that TikTok's completely unavailable to U.S. users who are really invested in using TikTok. Realize right now that there's a ban on TikTok here at the University of Texas, because the state of Texas has said that state institutions can't use TikTok on state-provided computers and other devices. You can't use TikTok on campus.
Every time you try to log on to TikTok in your office, you get shut down, right?
Yeah, but that's right. All those dozens of times I've tried, I've been stymied, right? But as you know, people use TikTok on campus all the time, right? And so there would be ways around. So those are your three options, Professor McDonald. What say you? What happens to TikTok?
All right, so first I'm going to divulge my source on this and kind of where I'm leaning to. So I listened to a podcast called Pivot, Kara Swisher and Scott Galloway, who've been talking about this a lot. Kara Swisher is probably one of the best tech reporters in the United States, deep roots, sources back to Silicon Valley in the 1990s, written for the New York Times. Well-sourced, just had a new book coming out, and they've talked a lot about the ban on TikTok. And their basic position is there's too much money at stake here for a real ban, and that's where I'd fall down on this. So we're talking about TikTok figuring it out, access to facilitate engagement by, the key market segment of the American economy. And if you think about media corporations, and 20 years ago, what did television? They wanted to make programs that appealed to people 18 to 30, because these are the groups of people that are going to have lots of disposable income 5 and 10 years from now. So TikTok has figured this out. So nobody wants a ban because there's opportunities to make a lot of money in the United States. So I think I would view this legislation by the House as a compromise that's designed to extract economic value from TikTok for American investors to make lots of money and to keep American young voters happy, which is, so we're going to force the sale of TikTok. Americans are going to make a bunch of money. So at least the second one, I don't see a ban. I see some type of forced sale, but then the question is, how does China respond to this? And, if I'm China, and you're talking about,
You resist.
Well,
wouldn't you?
well, I don't know if I want to escalate this issue into great power politics and get it captured in election politics that just undermines my bargaining position. I don't understand why I don't just use my hackers to steal some form of the algorithm and preserve access to, or reverse engineer the algorithm so I can have it in the future and use it in other states and develop a new, right? And so that's min. I think some form of this bill goes through. I think the president signs it because there's too much money to be made. And so if you think about this in the logistics of the Senate, is that some set of investors make a series of strategic campaign donations that get them the key votes within the Senate. It gets passed, Biden signs it. China will kick and scream, but the idea that they will give up access to, the technological widget here that generates all the value, I'm skeptical of, right? And so we might not hear it in the press, but I think that there'll be some effort to capture it.
So you're saying bill passes and China sells, but the sale is kind of...
The sale doesn't create what our congressional officials are telling us it will, which is it's going to permanently deprive the CCP of access to American data.
Use your data.
Yeah.
Right.
And then they'll count this as a political win.
Right.
And
so the influence, would the influence of China and Chinese government over TikTok be severed in that, or mitigated?
I don't know. I would say not necessarily completely severed, right? Perhaps slightly mitigated, but what I'm suggesting is you can still capture, the underlying capacity to reverse engineer or reconstruct this, or you can also, before the sale happens, capture all the data that exists at that point, right? I mean, if anything, if you think about this in a bargaining sense, the forced sale could create an incentive. So the skeptics say there's no evidence, or there's very limited evidence that China's used this. The forced sale of it would create an incentive on the part of the Chinese government. Well, if we've only got access to this data for the next 3 months, let's take it all right now.
Get it and bank it somewhere. Right?
That's not part of the debate. We got to think about this in terms of the strategic reality of this. Do you want to have a prediction, or are you just going to force me to do it? Be out here by myself?
No, you're not by yourself. I'm a little more pessimistic, I think, than you. I think that the law passes. I think it has to, because the two parties are both. I mean, the congressional parties are both committed to this, and so it passes. Gets signed into law. I don't think China just sells. I think they'll resist a sale or a full sale, and there'll be enough investigation that they don't quite give up the algorithm or what have you, and it falls through. And then there will be, and what I would say is that there'll be a ban, but, right? So there'd be a ban that works relatively ineffectively for most committed users of TikTok. And so then TikTok remains what it is. It gets banned in the United States, but anybody with a VPN or something like that to get around the ban just uses it. And the user rate goes down some, but it doesn't completely bottom out. And some other, probably American company fills that space. That's what I'd say. Not that different from you, but there's a crucial difference that China would be better off in my scenario, I would say.
Well, and it sounds like you're suggesting that this is going to escalate at the level of confrontation between the U.S. and China slightly more than I think.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen lots of escalations.
Yeah. So, and this is all, the other thing to keep in mind is this is all going to play out in the course of the campaign of 2024, right? And I think, the campaign is likely going to put more pressure on senators. I mean, imagine that you're a key vote in the Senate and your opponent is saying you're weak on China because you won't ban TikTok, right?
Yeah.
That it's then hard for these senators to say.
So say it plays out during the campaign, does Donald Trump during the campaign maintain his stance that, no, I'm against the ban. Everybody else is for it, but I'm against.
Yes, I think he does, right? And he just then, I think what he does is
he's the cool guy.
Well, no, I think he says this is about...
Is that an appeal to young voters?
No, this is an appeal to his base, saying this is about Facebook. Facebook is the enemy. Facebook's on the left. This is woke political culture, and
that
so
could
he
fire
shifts
up the base even more,
yeah,
right?
and so he changes the lines of conflict, where the debate right now is about U.S. China and data privacy, and he changes the conversation. And he's going to say it's not U.S. China, it's about
fat cat tech billionaires and
Facebook. And woke culture, right? So anyway, we're out of time.
Yeah,
right.
We are.
And one more segment. We don't know what we'll do. We'll decide 3 days before we film it in 2 weeks.
Okay.
All right. Have a good one. We'll see you later.